Hi everybody! This video talks about the upcoming project for Jane Austen and popular culture, which is the creative adaptation and rationale. So this project has two components. The first component is an adaptation of a selection from a Jane Austen novel, which you will create yourself. And the second component is a two-page rationale that explains your creative decisions. And in many respects, this rationale is basically the guide that I will be using when I grade your adaptation. So it's important that you take it seriously and pay attention to it. You're going to submit this project two different times. The first time you're going to submit a partial draft of your adaptation, and that's due on Sunday, April 8th. And you're going to submit that, and that week you're going to basically be reading some of your peers' drafts and giving them feedback and getting feedback on your own draft. And then the final draft of both the adaptation and the rationale is due on Sunday, April 22nd. And that's the point when you need to have your rationale finished as well as the final draft of your adaptation. So I'm going to talk about each of these components separately. And the first component I'll talk about is the adaptation. So for the adaptation, you will create your own adaptation of a selection from one of Austen's novels. You can pick from the options that are listed in the assignment instructions, which I'll go over in a few minutes, or you can propose your own idea. If you wish to propose your own idea, however, you need to get it approved by me. Otherwise, you might fail the assignment. So if you want to do something different, I really want you to think about other things, and I welcome your ideas, but I do want you to run them by me before you go ahead and do them. As far as what you adapt, you may choose any selection from the novels we've read for class, and you can set the adaptation in any time or place that you're familiar with. For example, you might even want to set your adaptation at Wichita State University. However, you can also retain the original setting of Regency England if you want to. And when you're choosing what part of the novel to adapt, I want you to think carefully about sort of the characters and the themes that you want to explore. So for example, if you want to explore in Elizabeth's independent spirit, you might want to adapt one of the conversations between her and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Or if you want to explore social expectations for women around sexuality, you might want to adapt a scene involving Lydia, or a scene involving Lydia and Mr. Wickham. Or if you want to explore Emma's overt active imagination, you may want to adapt the scene in which she begins to suspect that Jane Fairfax is in love with her friend's husband. So, I just begin thinking about, what is it that interests you about a character or an idea, and then select a scene, that can help you explore that idea. So now I'm going to go over the 4 different options that I give in the assignment instructions. And keep in mind that if you want to propose your own idea, you can do that as well. Just make sure you run it by me. So the first option I present in the assignment instructions is an epistolary narrative. And an epistolary narrative just means a narrative that's composed of letters, or in today's sort of technologies, you could also think of it as a narrative that's composed of emails or texts, or some other sort of correspondence between two people. So many of Austen's novels, including Pride and Prejudice, were first written as epistolary novels, which means a novel that's made up of the letters between two characters, before being revised into their current form. This option invites you to rewrite several chapters from one of Austen's narratives as a series of letters, emails, or even texts between characters. And as an aside, you don't have to rewrite several chapters if that's not what you want to do. If you think it makes sense to just rewrite a portion of one chapter, that's fine too. The important thing is that you're focusing on rewriting a portion of the novel as a series of letters, texts, or emails, or some sort of correspondence. The page requirement for this option will depend in part on the genre you choose, so whether you're writing in letters, emails, or texts. However, if you choose letters or emails, your final draft should be a minimum of 5 double-spaced pages. And if you choose do texts, send me an email or set up an appointment to talk with me, and we can talk about that. And your workshop draft, so the draft that you submit early, should be a minimum of 3 double-spaced pages if you're doing the emails or the letters option. So to help you sort of think through some of the possible ideas, I've given you some examples. You're welcome to pull from these examples and these ideas, or you can do your own thing. These are just some sort of ways to get you started thinking about your options. So one example might be to write a series of letters or emails from Elizabeth's perspective, telling her aunt or another character about her initial impressions of Mr. Bingley, his sisters, and Mrs. Darcy. Another idea might be to write a series of emails or texts from Lydia's perspective, telling Kitty about her adventures at Brighton and her developing relationship with Mr. Wickham before she elopes. Another option would be to write a series of emails or texts from Mr. Darcy's perspective, telling his sister or another character about his initial impressions of the Bennet family. Or you could write a series of letters or emails from Mr. Elton's perspective of Emma about his courtship of Emma and its disastrous ending. So these are just all different ideas. And again, you can pick one of these, or you can choose your own sort of character and scene from the novel to adapt. These are just sort of things to sort of get you started thinking about what are some different ideas and ways to get started. All right, option 2 is a series of video blogs. So this option invites you to create a script and produce your series of video blogs similar to the Lizzie Bennet diaries. For example, you could imagine how Emma could be adapted to the 21st century and create a series of video blogs from the perspective of Anna Woodhouse or Harriet Smith. If you choose this option, your final draft of the script should be a minimum of 5 double-spaced pages. So I do want you to submit a script and then also produce the videos and post them to YouTube and submit that along with the script. And for the workshop draft that's due earlier, you would just need to submit a script that's at least 3 double-spaced pages. And also, just to give you a sense, one double-spaced page of text usually is around sort of 2 minutes of airtime. So if you're producing 5 pages of a script, then that means you'll probably have about 10 minutes that you have to produce, just to sort of so you know about what that means. So in that little description, I gave you a couple examples, and here I'm just going to give you a couple more ideas. So sort of more things to sort of think about as you consider your options. So you could create a series of video blogs from Mary's perspective of Pride and Prejudice, discussing her views of her parents and various sisters. You could create a series of video blogs from Mr. Darcy's perspective, discussing his initial impressions of the Bennet family. You could create a series of video blogs from Emma's perspective, discussing the latest gossip in the town and her desire to set her friends up. Or you could create a series of, that's a mistake. Create a video blog from Mr. Elton's perspective, discussing his sort of failed attempt to date Emma. So all of these, again, are sort of starting points, but you're welcome to think about your own ideas and come up with your own starting points as well. All right, option number 3 is a graphic narrative. So if you have talents as an artist or illustrator, you may want to create a graphic narrative, which is similar to a comic book, based on 1 or 2 chapters from Austen's novels. And again, if you want to pick a smaller selection, like just a scene, you can do that as well. The important thing is that your final draft meets the requirements that I gave you, and you can focus on as small or long a selection of the novel as you really want. If you choose this option, your final draft should have a minimum of 10 panels, and a panel is just an image that conveys sort of one segment of narrative action. So usually it's one image and it may have some text in it, whether that's speech bubbles or a caption or something like that. So your final draft should have 10 of those, and your workshop draft, which is due earlier, should have a minimum of 6 panels. And those don't need to be completed. They don't need to be like fully illustrated or colored in. They should just, sort of give a sense of what the action is happening and what people are saying in those panels. So again, I'm going to give you some sort of ideas, starting points for this option if you are interested in it. So one starting point would be to reimagine Pride and Prejudice in a contemporary context and create a series of panels that introduces readers to each member of the Bennet family. So you could have, that basically sort of walks the reader through each of the characters and sort of explains how they sort of fit together in their personalities. Or you could reimagine Emma in a contemporary context and create a series of panels that introduces the readers to the primary characters and the social structure of the community or the school, or whatever sort of society that's living in. You could create a series of panels that depict a specific scene from one of the novels, like Mr. Collins' proposal to Elizabeth or Charlotte's revelation that she's engaged to Mr. Collins. Or you could create a series of panels that provides the backstory of a minor character like Mr. Collins or Harriet Smith. So these are all options. If you can take these and run with these, or you can come up with your own idea too. Either one is fine. And if you are interested in this option, you may want to check out Marvel's comic series, Adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, which is available at this URL. You can also just Google Marvel Pride and Prejudice comics, and you'll probably be within the first couple results that you get to. So, and you don't have to, you can look at a couple of those online before, in order to read the whole thing, you obviously have to buy it. But this will going to this link, you can sort of preview them, and it can give you a sense of sort of what they did to adapt Pride and Prejudice to the sort of comic graphic narrative genre. And then the final option that I give you is a board game. So if you're a board game enthusiast, you may want to create a game that's based on the plot of one or more of Austen's novels. And this option will require you to think carefully about how the narrative structure of Austen's fiction, which usually revolves around the search for a suitable marriage partner, can be adapted for the narrative structure of a game, which obviously usually revolves around winning in some kind of way. You may also want to consider how the unwritten social codes that governed everything from how one dressed to whom one married during the Regency period can be expressed through the rules of a board game. So, for example, obviously, you might need to have the rule that you need to marry somebody of the opposite gender, because that was obviously the only marital option that happened during this time period. So that would sort of be one example of that. If you choose this option, your final draft should be the board and game pieces, and you can just submit images of these. You can just draw them and scan them and submit them. That's totally fine. You don't need to print it out and put it on cardstock. That's just images are fine. And as well as the rule book. And for the workshop draft, so for the earlier portion of this, you should at least have sort of a preliminary image of the board and sort of a working draft of the rule book. So again, I have some ideas, some starting points for this if you're interested in this. So one example might be to create a board game in which the goal of the game is for players to find and become engaged to a suitable partner. So they could go around the board, and as they go around the board, they could meet people and sort of possibly interact with them, and then possibly end up married to them. Another example would be to create a board game that's organized more around sort of social status. So in which the goal of the game is for players to gather accomplishments like singing, dancing, playing the piano, in order to sort of earn social status points. Again, that's a starting point. You're welcome to sort of take those and run with them, or come up with your own idea. And then, as I say here, I also have a couple examples of real games that people have created based on Austen's novels that I'd be happy to show you if you want to come by my office. So I do have those, and I can show this to you if this is something that you're interested in. Okay, so in addition to the creative portion of this project, you also need to write a rationale. So your rationale basically should lay out the major goals of your adaptation and then explain how you sought to realize those goals through your creative choices. So it basically says, what is it you are trying to accomplish and how did you accomplish them? And it should be a minimum of 2 full double-spaced pages. And I said earlier, the rationale is going to be basically what I sort of use as my guide in grading this. So I'm going to sort of look at what goal you said your goals were, and look at how you said you met those goals, and then see, if that sort of makes sense to me based on what you submit. And that's basically going to be how I grade your creative portion of this. So your rationale is important, and you should be sure that you take it seriously. So at a minimum, your rationale should answer 3 questions, and I'm going to go through each of these 3 questions. In addition to that, it can also discuss other aspects of your adaptation. So you don't need to limit yourself to those 3 questions, or if there's something else you think that I need to know as I'm reading and grading your work, you can definitely include that. So the first question it should address is, what is the setting of your adaptation? So for example, is it set in Regency England during Austen's time period, or is it in 21st century Wichita? And then how do you communicate that setting through your creative choices? So for example, how do you use things like clothing or hairstyles or furniture or decorations or props to indicate the time and place your adaptation is set? When we watch Clueless, for example, when we sort of first turn on the TV, we know that, we're not in Austen's time period. We know that we're in California and that we're in a time period where people probably have a lot of money and it's warm and sunny. And then as it goes on, we find out that we're in a high school through the things the characters say and the way they talk to each other. So, those are choices to sort of indicate the setting. So, what is your setting that you set your adaptation in, and how did you do that? Did you dress characters in a specific way? Did you have them use certain kinds of slang? Did you have them talk about things like classes or school or sports? How do you sort of subtly indicate, where they live and what sort of social situation they're in through your choices as a writer or illustrator or producer of some kind? All right, the second question I want you to consider is, what characters does your adaptation focus on and how does it represent them? So in other words, I want you to reflect on what precisely characters do and say in your adaptation, and what these actions and words reveal about their personalities and development. So if Emma is a character in your adaptation, what is Emma doing and what is she saying and what does that reveal about her? What she says reveal about her personality? What does it reveal about her sort of own level of self-awareness? What does it reveal about her assumptions around other people? And then the third thing I want you to think about is, what sort of major themes does your adaptation deal with and how does it develop them? And the word theme is pretty vague and it can feel really sort of abstract. So another way to approach this is to think about, what are just ideas that your adaptation is engaging with, and how does it engage with those? You don't need to be saying anything super big or important. I just want you to think about ways in which you're engaging with these ideas, even at sort of a small or sort of lesser important level. So, for example, if you've adapted a portion of Pride and Prejudice, you might want to consider what your adaptation suggests about love or marriage or prejudice, or the social expectations of women, or another idea. And to be even more specific, say you're adapting a scene that involves Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, you might think about, how is that relationship being presented? Is sort of social class at play there? Is sort of the importance of sort of mutual respect something that you're sort of trying to portray through whatever choices you're making? Is the importance of sort of a person's moral character something that you're paying attention to? We know that Wickham was an undesirable character because he was sort of bad, because he treated people poorly, and Elizabeth comes to sort of respect Darcy in part because she realizes that he treats the people around him sort of well. So so that's one sort of theme. That's one idea that the novel deals with. And if you're adapting, that relationship in some kind of way, then how are you treating that idea? How are you treating the relationship? What seems to be important to each of them in a marriage partner, and how are you conveying that? Or if you're adapting a portion of Emma, what does your adaptation suggest about, say, the dangers of an overactive imagination, or the difficulty of knowing your own heart, or the difficulty of sort of reading other people? So, for example, if you're, adapting a scene in which Emma's trying to sort of set up Harriet with Mr. Elton, how are you sort of, conveying Emma's own sort of shortcomings and her sort of lack of awareness of her shortcomings, which is, one of the themes that the novel deals with. So, again, let me just reiterate, that I'm not expecting you to create something that that is super focused on a theme, or that conveys a really sort of important idea. I just want you to think about how you are taking the themes that are already existing in the novel and how you are reworking those in your own work, even if it's in just a sort of small, minor way. Okay, moving on to something a little bit more clear-cut, which are the formatting guidelines. So the length of your actual adaptation is going to depend on the options that you choose, and you can see the descriptions in the instructions or earlier in this video for guidelines on the page limit for each of the options. And then the rationale, as I said earlier, should be a minimum of 2 full pages. The written portion of your project, so your rationale and then anything else you write, should follow MLA formatting guidelines. So that means it should be type 12-point Times New Roman or Garamond font. Should be double spaced. It should have 1-inch margins on each side. It should have page numbers and your last name in the top right corner. And the first page should have a heading at the top left corner that has your name, the instructor's name, that's my name, the class, and the date. And then as far as deadlines go, as I said earlier, a partial draft of the adaptation is due on Sunday, April 8th. And at this point, you don't need to submit a draft of the rationale, just that partial draft of the adaptation. And then the final draft of both the adaptation and the rationale together are due Sunday, April 22nd. So if you have any questions about this, please let me know. You can send me an email. You can post to the Ask My Instructor discussion board. I'm happy to set up a meeting to talk with you if you want to go over your ideas. I can do that. We can do that in person in my office, or we can do that over Skype, or we can even set up something via chat if that's easier for you. So I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with, and please let me know if you have questions.